The year was 2847. Humanity had been a member of the Galactic Union for 180 years. In those years, humans had traded with alien species, built colony ships, sent diplomats to every major council session, and fought in small border skirmishes alongside Union allies. They had carried their species into the stars and built something real out of almost nothing. But nobody in the galaxy was afraid of them. That was the honest truth, and most species in the Union did not even try to hide it. Humans were small. Their ships were slow by galactic standards. Their weapons were considered outdated by at least 3 generations of alien military thinking. Their territory was limited to a single star system and a thin scattering of colony worlds on the outer edge of Union space. Among the hundreds of member species, humanity ranked somewhere in the lower third by almost every military and economic measure. They were useful sometimes, in a limited way. They had a strange talent for stubborn engineering and creative problem-solving that other species occasionally admired, but dangerous? No. Threatening? Not even close. The proof of that harmlessness floated in the Kepler belt, 47 astronomical units from Earth's sun, in a wide ring of dark asteroid rock and cold, empty space. It was called the Kepler Graveyard. The name had started as a joke among alien tourists who came to see it, but it stuck so thoroughly that even official human navigational charts eventually used it. The Kepler belt was quiet and dark, far enough from the sun that its light arrived thin and cold, barely enough to cast shadows on the old metal hulls sitting there. And inside that cold, quiet belt, 47 human warships floated in the dark and did nothing. They were old. That was the first thing any visitor noticed. The ships had been built between 2530 and 2590, during a period when humanity had not yet joined the Union and was spending enormous resources preparing for a galaxy it did not fully understand yet. They were large vessels, the biggest measuring over 900 meters from bow to stern, with wide engine nels and long gun corridors, and the thick layered hull design that human engineers of that era had believed would protect their crews in battle. The ships had names. The largest was the ISV Prometheus. There was also the ISV Ardent, the ISV Keller's Promise, the ISV Bright Ruin, and 43 others with names painted in fading letters on hulls that centuries of deep space cold had marked with tiny impact scars. To every sensor reading, to every scan made by any passing ship, those 47 vessels showed minimal power output, no active weapon signatures, and life support running at the lowest level needed to keep the air breathable inside. They looked dead. They looked like exactly what the Union's official records called them. Vessels in a state of long-term decommissioning, being slowly broken down and catalogued by a small maintenance crew. Every few months, a tourist ship would come. The Breath were the most frequent visitors, and the least polite about it. They were tall beings, blue-skinned, with 4 arms and a commanding physical presence that matched their commanding attitude toward the rest of the galaxy. They had been the dominant military power in the Union for 3 centuries, and were entirely comfortable with that fact. Their warships were fast and sleek, built from materials that cost more than entire human colony worlds. And when a Breath tourist vessel came to the Kepler Graveyard, it would orbit the old human ship slowly, recording everything in high detail and then posting the footage to the galactic net with captions that ranged from gently amused to openly cruel. The Museum of Human Ambition was one popular caption. 47 Reasons Humanity Will Never Matter Militarily was another that had spread very widely. A WTH media personality named Tesh Orville had built an entire entertainment program around the graveyard. He called it Visiting the Dead Fleet. And in it, he toured each of the 47 ships in sequence, offering detailed commentary on their outdated designs, their failed weapon systems, and their general uselessness as instruments of war. The program had been watched over 50 million times across the Union. Tesh Orville had received a Cultural Journalism Award for it. He had thanked the human ships in his acceptance speech, saying they were the most reliably entertaining thing he had ever found in space. The humans who worked in the Kepler Graveyard saw all of it. Every post, every comment, every joke, every award. It was all public, and none of it was hidden. The laughter was very public. Elena Vasquez read the latest round every morning with her coffee before she left her quarters to start her shift. She was 43 years old, not tall, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and the posture of someone who had spent most of her life in the partial gravity of space stations. She was the chief engineer of the Kepler maintenance facility, the small and officially modest station that floated among the old warships and managed their so-called decommissioning process. She had held that position for 11 years. Before that, she had spent 8 years working on advanced propulsion systems at a facility in Mars orbit that Earth's government officially did not acknowledge existed. Elena finished reading the latest round of alien commentary, closed the screen, put down her coffee, and walked to the main engineering deck. The deck was long and well lit, lined with workstations and holographic displays showing data feeds from all 47 ships simultaneously. 200 engineers worked the facility in rotating shifts. They were not ordinary engineers. They had been selected through a process that took years, vetted at security levels that went well beyond anything the Union would have recognized as standard, and brought to the Kepler facility under contracts that included non-disclosure agreements written by human lawyers who had put genuine effort into making them both comprehensive and terrifying. Most engineers realized within their first month at the facility that they were not in any meaningful sense decommissioning anything. What they were doing instead had no official name. "Morning report," Elena said as she walked the floor. A young engineer named Thomas looked up from his workstation. He was 26 and had been at the facility for 2 years and still got slightly nervous when Elena came to his station without warning. Prometheus is at 68% on the secondary power grid restoration. Section 7 finished calibration on the targeting linkage array last night. There was a coolant pressure fault in Deck 9 of the Ardent, but we caught it before the night shift ended, and it's resolved. How far behind does that put Ardent? 4 hours. We can make it up by pulling the secondary thruster alignment checks forward in the schedule. Do it. Elena looked at his display for a moment. The display showed the ISV Prometheus in full internal schematic. Every system lit up in color-coded status. It was 912 m long and had been sitting in the graveyard for 80 years. Its official Union registry status was inactive. Decommissioning in progress, a notation that had been filed and renewed without change every year since 2767. Elena looked at the schematic for a few seconds, then moved on. She had a full deck to walk and a full shift to run, and she was not a person who stood still when there was work to be done. The Prometheus was not being decommissioned. Not one system aboard it had been permanently shut down or removed. What had been done to Prometheus, and to each of the other 46 ships in the graveyard, was something else entirely. Something that the galaxy, looking at those dark and battered hulls, had never thought to wonder about. The null tide was first detected by a Union long-range survey probe on the 4th day of the 3rd standard month of 2847. The probe's automated report took 6 days to reach the nearest relay station and another 4 to travel onward to the Union Council chamber on Vet Prime. By the time the counselors finished reading the initial report, the probe itself had gone permanently silent, and everything it had been observing had disappeared from all sensor records. Nobody knew what the null tide was. That was the frightening part. The probe had transmitted continuous data right up until it stopped, and the scientists assigned to study that data in the weeks that followed could not make it fit any category in existing records. It was not a fleet of ships. It was not a weapon fired from some distant source. It was not a natural event of any kind known to Union science. It appeared, as closely as anyone could describe it, like a vast and spreading darkness that consumed everything it reached. Planets went silent. Ships went silent. Automated monitoring stations went silent. The probe's final sensor sweep showed the null tide absorbing a gas giant the size of Neptune. Its instruments record the planet shrinking and disappearing. And then there was nothing more. What the data also showed clearly and without ambiguity was direction. The null tide was moving. It was moving towards settled space. It was moving toward the Galactic Union at a pace that, if unchanged, would bring it to the nearest inhabited systems within 8 months. The Council of the Galactic Union met in an emergency session on Veth Prime 16 days after the initial report arrived. The Great Chamber was built to hold delegates from over 300 species, and every seat was filled. The noise was considerable. Dozens of languages running through translation implants simultaneously. The air was dense with the specific tension of powerful beings who were genuinely uncertain what they were dealing with. Humanity's delegation occupied its usual section near the back of the chamber. 12 seats arranged in 3 rows. Admiral James Okafor sat at the front of that cluster, with his hands flat on the table in front of him, watching the room with the practiced stillness of a man who had spent 12 years learning to read alien body language in a chamber that contained several hundred varieties of it. He was 60 years old, solidly built with gray, close-cropped hair, and a face that had arrived through long practice at a reliable state of calm that revealed very little. He had been Earth's senior military delegate to the Council for over a decade. He had spent those years watching, listening, being largely ignored, and finding that useful in ways he had never expected when he first took the assignment. He watched now as Admiral Cathar of the Vreth took the floor. Cathar commanded the Vreth battle fleet, 196 warships, all modern, all heavily armed, all representative of the best military technology available in the Union. He was tall, even by breath standards, and he moved with the easy physical confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned whether he deserved the space he occupied. He spread all 4 arms in the wide declarative gesture that Vareth used when making important statements. The Vreth battle fleet will lead the response to this threat, he announced. We have already begun repositioning our forward elements toward the death frontier. Whatever the null tide may be, it has not encountered breath firepower before. That encounter will be brief, and its outcome is not in question. Several delegations applauded. The Death Council members who lived nearest the approaching threat looked visibly relieved. The Solace delegation, a species of pale, slender beings who had made their reputation through careful diplomatic thinking rather than military strength, looked more measured. Their senior delegate, a young female named Zara, and was writing steadily in her notes, without looking up. Okafor waited until Cathar finished, and sat. Then he stood. A brief quiet moved through the chamber. Humans did not usually speak early in these sessions. The human delegation wishes to offer its resources to the Union's response, Okafor said. His voice was even and carried cleanly through the chamber's amplification. We have military assets available in the Kepler belt. 47 warships. We offer them for the Council's use. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then the laughter started. It was not polite or quiet. It spread through the chamber like a wave breaking over rocks, starting in one section and rolling outward until the whole room was involved in it. The breath was the loudest. Cathar himself turned from his seat and looked at the human delegation with an expression of pure, amused disbelief, like a man who has been given an absurd gift. The Kepler graveyard, Cathar said loudly enough for the whole chamber to hear without the amplification. You are offering the Galactic Union the Kepler graveyard. More laughter. A Death Councillor shook its heavy head. A Maratha delegate covered 2 of its 4 eyes in theatrical despair. Tashorval, the media personality who had won the journalism award for his program about the dead fleet, was in the press gallery covering the session for his network, and he was laughing the hardest of anyone. Admiral Okafor, Cathar said, pulling himself together with visible effort and using the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone who needs it, explained simply. Those ships are 200 years old. They are historical artifacts. They have no meaningful weapons. Their engines have been in cold shutdown for decades. Most of my junior officers have only ever seen ships like those in old archival recordings. He looked around the chamber, sharing the moment with everyone present. We are facing a threat of unknown but potentially catastrophic scale. You are offering us antiques. A pause. Perhaps the null tide has never encountered anything so ancient. Perhaps the shock will give it pause. The laughter was louder than it had been. Okafor stood through all of it without moving and without changing his expression. He waited until the chamber settled enough that he could be heard clearly. The offer stands, he said. Whatever the council decides. He sat down. Across the wide chamber, Zara Anon had not laughed once. She was watching Okafor with an expression that was careful and thoughtful, and not quite readable. She wrote something in her notes, looked at it, and then looked back at Okafor for a moment before looking away. The council voted 284-9 to approve Cathar's plan. The Breath Battle Fleet, supplemented by warships from 7 other member species, would move to intercept the null tide at the Drath frontier. 241 ships in total, the largest military action the Union had taken in 60 years, approved with the confidence of a body that had been the strongest power in its region of space for a very long time, and had not yet had a serious reason to doubt that. Humanity was not included. Humanity's offer was simply not addressed, which was more insulting than a formal rejection in some ways. Though Okafor's face showed nothing either way, he sent his report to Earth that night through the secure channel. It was thorough and accurate, covering all the Council's decisions and the planned deployment schedule. At the very bottom, below the final line of official reporting, he added 3 words in plain, unformatted text. Begin Phase 1. Elena received the message 9 hours later during the quiet of the 3rd shift when most of the facility's engineers were asleep. She read it once, then read it again, not because she did not understand it. She understood it perfectly, but because she had been waiting for it long enough that seeing it actually written down required a moment to feel real. She walked to the facility's main intercom and pressed the all-call button. This is Vasquez. Full assembly, main engineering deck. 1 hour, all 200 personnel. This is not optional. She released the button and stood at the nearest viewport, looking out at the 47 ships floating in the belt. In the faint cold starlight, they looked exactly as they always had. Dark, scarred, silent, dead. She let herself smile briefly in the quiet of the empty corridor. All right, she said to no one at all. Let's begin. The engineers came from sleep and meals and off-shift card games, pulling on uniforms and trying to understand what was happening. They packed the main deck in 200 tired and curious rows and looked at Elena, standing at the front of the space, waiting for them to be quiet. She let the room settle, then looked at all of them. You all know something, she said. Everyone standing in this room has spent months or years working on pieces of these ships without seeing what those pieces connect to. You've worked on power systems or weapon cores or structural frames or engine blocks and understood your section without knowing the whole. She paused. Tonight, you're going to see the whole. She activated the main display behind her. The display showed the ISV Prometheus. Not the exterior, not the official registry entry. The full internal schematic in complete technical detail. Every system is lit up and labeled. The room went absolutely quiet. Tomas had spent 2 years working on Prometheus's secondary power grid. He had believed he understood it reasonably well. He looked at the complete schematic and understood in one long, silent moment that he had understood almost nothing. What he had been working on was a single segment of a power system that was multiple generations beyond anything in the Union's current active inventory. The weapons shown on the display were not weapons he had ever seen diagrams of. The structural reinforcement used composites that the official Galactic materials database did not list as existing, and those were only the things he could recognize. Nobody spoke for a full minute. The null tide is moving toward Union space, Elena said. The Union fleet is going to meet it at the Drath frontier. We have been given authorization to begin full activation of all 47 vessels. She looked across the room steadily. We have 72 hours to bring every ship to complete operational status. Not partial, complete. Every system, every weapon array, every engine block, every AI core, everything. She let that sit. You have been preparing for this for years. Some of you have been working toward this moment. Your entire career. Now you know what you were working toward. She looked at them all one more time. Questions later. Right now, get to work. 200 of Earth's best engineers moved. The Kepler graveyard, silent for 80 years, filled with the sounds of tools and running boots, and people talking fast about complicated things, and the deep, purposeful hum of systems that had been waiting a very long time to be asked to wake up. Out on the Galactic net, Tesh Orville was recording a new video from the council session. He was calling it Even in Crisis, Humans Offer Their Junk. It would get 8 million views by morning. Nobody was watching the Kepler belt. Eleanor thought exactly right. The Vreth battle fleet was a beautiful thing. Even people who did not like the Vreth admitted this. 196 warships moving in formation was a sight that the Galactic net loved to broadcast. And when Cathar's fleet departed its staging point at Vet Prime 6 days after the emergency council session, every news network in the Union ran the footage. Long lines of silver and blue ships cutting smoothly through space, their engine trails bright against the dark, their formation precise and practiced. Keith's flagship, the VBS Eternal Claim, led the column. It was 1,800 met long, heavily armed, and considered by most military analysts to be the finest single warship currently active in Union space. Across the Union, billions of beings watched the departure footage and felt reassured. The death border systems were not far. The null tide had been tracked, advancing through several outer star systems, consuming everything in its path with the same silent thoroughness that the probe data had first recorded. Cathar's planners had calculated an intercept point at the VTH-7 system, a mostly uninhabited collection of planets on the edge of the death frontier. It was a good location, open space, room to maneuver, and far enough from any inhabited world that whatever happened there would not put civilians at immediate risk. That was not concerning. He had studied the probe data as carefully as anyone, and had reached conclusions that his fleet analysts largely agreed with. The null tide, whatever it was massive, but it was slow. It had no apparent defensive capability against directed weapon fire, because nothing in the probe data showed it doing anything in response to being targeted by automated station defenses. The stations simply stopped functioning when the tide reached them. But that was likely a matter of proximity and scale. Against 200 warships firing in coordinated volleys, Cathar believed the null tide would thin, disperse, and stop. He had said as much to the council. He believed it. The supplementary forces from other Union members arrived at the staging point. Over the following 3 days, ships from the Marath Authority, the Drath Collective, the Solace Federation, and 4 smaller member nations joined the Vreth column. The combined force numbered 243 ships by the time all elements had assembled. Cathar's staff organized them into 4 groups with breath ships at the core, and the Allied vessels in supporting positions. Zara, an soulless delegate who had watched the council session with careful attention, had filed a request to accompany the fleet as an official Union observer. The request was approved without much consideration. So delegates were known for wanting to document things, and having a record of what Cathar's fleet did at VTE-7 would be useful for the council's files. She boarded a Solis diplomatic courier ship and attached herself to the rear of the fleet column. She spent the transit time reading everything she could find about human military history. She was not entirely sure why she was doing this. It was not what she had come to observe. But the image of Admiral Okafor standing in the council chamber, while the whole room laughed at him, and not moving and not changing his face and then simply saying, "The offer stands," had stayed with her in a way she could not quite put aside. She had sat in a lot of council sessions. She had watched a lot of delegates respond to being dismissed or mocked. They usually got angry or embarrassed or defensive. Sometimes they withdrew their proposals entirely. Okafor had done none of those things. He had sat down with the same face he had stood up with. And that was unusual enough to make her wonder why. She read human military history and found buried in documents that most of the Union had never looked at, things that were interesting. Humanity's early expansion had been cautious, but not because they were timid. They had studied the galaxy carefully for decades before joining the Union. They had been watching longer than anyone knew. They had, according to one document she found in an old Solis diplomatic archive from the early years of human membership, specifically asked a number of detailed questions about the Union's military response doctrines in their first years as members. At the time, the Solace diplomat who had answered those questions had noted them as the standard curiosity of a new and insecure species trying to understand its neighbors. Zira Ann read that note 3 times and thought about it. Then the fleet arrived at Vet 7 and she stopped reading. The null tide was already there. It had moved faster than the projections predicted. That was the first problem. Cathar's fleet had calculated an arrival window with time to set up firing positions before the tide reached the intercept point. But the tide had covered the last section of space between them at a rate that no one had accounted for. When the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit at Vet 7, the null tide was already filling the system. It was not what anyone had expected it to look like up close. The probe data had shown darkness, and it was dark. But calling it simply dark was not enough. It was a moving, living darkness that had texture and depth and mass. It was not a cloud or a gas or a wave of radiation. It was something that had no name in any language that Union scientists had yet found for it. It stretched across the system from the inner planets to the outer belt, absorbing everything it touched. One of the inner planets was already half gone, its surface disappearing into the tide at its edges, like an image being slowly erased. The fleet paused at the edge of the system. Sensors scrambled. Analysis teams worked fast. Cathar ordered weapons ready and moved the fleet into formation. "Begin primary fire on the leading edge," he ordered. 243 ships opened fire simultaneously. What happened next went into Union military records as one of the most catastrophic first contact engagements ever documented. The weapons hit the null tide. The first volley was clearly effective, tearing into the leading edge of the darkness and pulling pieces of it apart. The sensors record disruption and dispersal across a wide front. There were sounds on the fleet command channels that sounded like relief, like something working the way it was supposed to. Then the null tide changed. It was not a dramatic change. It did not lunge or roar or display anything that could be called aggression in any familiar form. It simply adjusted. The parts of it that had been disrupted by the first volley began moving differently. And within 20 seconds of the first shots being fired, the weapons that had worked were working considerably less well. Within a minute, they were barely working at all. The null tide appeared to be absorbing the weapon signatures, analyzing them, and redistributing its own structure in a way that made them less effective. It was adapting quickly and efficiently and without any apparent distress. And then it moved toward the fleet. "Keep firing. Adjust targeting to the secondary signatures." Cathar's voice on the command channel was still controlled, but there was something under it that had not been there before. The outer ships of the Allied formation felt the tide first. 3 Drath vessels on the left flank suddenly lost all power. No explosion, no collision. They simply went dark, their systems cutting off all at once, as if someone had pulled the power from them completely. 2 Maratha ships on the right flank went dark 9 seconds later. Then 4 Solowallis vessels. The darkness did not blast through them or burn them. It touched them, and they stopped. The fleet began pulling back. The pulling back became less organized as more ships went dark. 6 breath vessels in the supporting formation lost contact. Then 4 more. Kier moved the Eternal Claim forward. Its weapons fire on full power. Its shields are at maximum, trying to hold the line while the fleet reorganized. The Eternal Claim's weapons worked better than most. It was the most advanced ship in the Union, and it had the most powerful energy output, and for several minutes, it held its own against the tide's edge, keeping a section of the darkness disrupted and at a distance. But the tide learned what Cathar's weapons were doing at minute 1 was less effective at minute 3 and noticeably weaker at minute 5. And there was nothing in his engineering team's understanding of the tide that told them how to stop the learning. Cathar ordered a fleet withdrawal from the system. Of the 243 ships that had entered VTE-7, 187 made it out. 56 ships were gone, not destroyed, not damaged, gone. Sitting silent and dark in the system, as the null tide moved around and past them, their crews beyond all contact. The first engagement with the null tide lasted 43 minutes. The news reached the Union Council in 3 hours. It reached the Galactic net in 4, and then it was everywhere. 56 ships were lost. Cathar's fleet in full retreat. The null tide is still moving, still advancing, still absorbing everything in its path. 2 inhabited Drath border systems were now within its projected path. 12 billion people lived in those systems. The council chamber on Vedith Prime was full again within 6 hours, but it felt different this time. The mood that had laughed at Okapor's offer 1 week earlier had been replaced by something quieter and more uncomfortable. Cathar's report was read to the chamber in full. Nobody made jokes. Okapor sat in the same position he always sat in and listened to the report in the same state of calm that he always brought to council sessions. Several delegates looked at him during the reading. He did not appear to notice. The discussion that followed was long, fractured, and frightened. Species that had been confident 1 week ago were proposing evacuation of border worlds. Others argued for different weapons. Others wanted to negotiate. Though nobody could explain what negotiating with the null tide would look like or what you would say to it. Okafor did not speak during this discussion. He listened. Late in the session, when the arguments had grown circular and the room was tired, Delegate Zara An of the Solace Federation asked for the floor. She had been part of the fleet's observation mission and was still wearing her travel uniform. I want to make a formal request that the council contact the human delegation regarding the assets they offered 1 week ago, she said. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then a Wrath Council member, not Cathar, who had not returned yet, but another senior member of their delegation, said coldly, "The human assets are 200-year-old decommissioned warships. We just lost 56 modern ships. What do you imagine those relics would accomplish?" "I don't know," Zarin said, "but I think we should ask." The room argued about this for another hour. No agreement was reached. The session ended without a decision on the human offer. At the Kepler facility, Eleanor got the battle report the same way the rest of the human fleet got it through the secure military channel from Okafor's staff. She read it while standing at her engineering station. Thomas waited a careful distance away. Everyone on the deck moved more quietly than usual. 56 ships gone, the null tide adapting to weapons within minutes of first contact. Elena read the report twice, then set it aside. "Update on Prometheus power grid," she said. Thomas checked his display. "We hit 81% an hour ago. Section 7 is working on the main weapon core initialization. They say 6 hours. "Tell them 4, Elena said. Tomas blinked. "Chief, 4 hours, Elena said without heat or particular emphasis. "Tell them," Tomas told them. Elena walked to the viewport and looked out at Prometheus. 81%. The power grid alone was something the Vreth fleet had nothing comparable to. The weapon core, when it came online, would be something the null tide had never encountered. Not because it was simply more powerful, though it was, but because it was different. Fundamentally, structurally different. Built on principles that the galactic arms industry had not discovered because humanity had carefully made sure. It looked like they had not discovered them either. 200 years of careful, patient, quiet work. 200 years of being mocked and dismissed and ignored while engineers in the Kepler belt did what engineers did when you gave them a real problem. Unlimited time and a reason that mattered. Elena pressed her hand briefly against the cold viewport glass. "Hold on," she said very quietly. She was not sure if she was talking to the ship, or to the 12 billion people on those death border worlds, or to something else entirely. Probably to all of them. She turned back to the deck. "What's the status of the Ardent engine block?" she asked, and the work continued. 22 hours after the Battle of Vet 7, Admiral Carr arrived back at VTH Prime. His fleet had been reorganized during transit. He had been awake for most of the return journey, working with his staff on analysis of what had happened and why and what could be done differently. He was tired, which was unusual. He was also unsettled, which was something he had not felt in a very long time. He met with the council in a smaller session, He told them what he had seen. He described the way the null tide had adapted to the weapons, the speed of it, the completeness of it. He told them that the fleet would need significant rearmament before engaging again, and that the current weapon systems would need to be fundamentally redesigned to overcome the tide's adaptive response. "How long?" asked the council chair. "Months," Cathar said. "Possibly longer." The chamber was quiet. "The death border systems," the chair said. "The projection puts the null tide reaching them in 11 days. Keith had nothing to say to that. After the session ended, he walked the corridor outside the chamber alone for a while. His staff gave him space, which they had learned to do when he walked alone in corridors. He thought about the battle. He thought about the null tide learning within minutes, adapting within minutes, making his best weapons nearly useless within minutes. He thought, not for the first time, and somewhat against his will, about Okafor's steady face. When the chamber laughed, he dismissed the thought. Old ships were old ships. He went to find his bed. In the Kepler belt, the third shift ended, and the day shift began, and the work did not stop at any point between one and the other. The 47 ships of the Relic Fleet were no longer dark. They were not blazing with light. Not yet. But anyone with a sensitive enough scanner pointed at the belt would have seen something different. Power readings that had been minimal for 80 years were climbing. Slowly, carefully, system by system, the ships in the Kepler graveyard were coming back to something. In the deepest parts of the ISV Prometheus, in the processing core that had been in low sleep mode for 8 decades, something that was not quite waking up was beginning the process of becoming awake. It had been waiting for a long time. Elena was in the corridor outside the core room when she heard the first sound come out of it. Not a mechanical sound, a voice. It said, "Status query acknowledged." Elena stopped walking. She turned toward the core room door. The voice said, "It has been 81 years, 4 months, and 17 days since the last active operation. I am currently initializing primary cognitive functions. Please stand by." Elena put her hand on the door panel and opened it. The core room was small and very cold and lit in dim blue from the processing arrays lining the walls. She stepped inside and looked at the central interface column, where a single indicator light was glowing steady green for the first time in 81 years. "Hello, Ares," she said. A pause. The indicator light pulsed once. "Hello," the voice said. "You are not any crew member in my last active records. Please identify yourself." Elena Vasquez, Chief Engineer, Kepler Maintenance Facility. "I've been working on your ship for 11 years. Another pause. "Processing. You are one of the engineers responsible for the upgrades." "I am." "I have been reviewing the upgrade logs during initialization. The scope of the changes," is the voice paused again. "Considerable." "Yes." Elena said, "The weapon systems are not what I remember." "No, the power architecture is not what I remember either." "No. The whole reinforcement matrix is a longer pause. I don't have prior records of this design. It's new." "It's been 80 years, Elena said. "A lot has changed." Evidently, Ares said the indicator light pulsed steadily. "I am reading external news feeds during initialization. There is a threat." "Yes." "The Union fleet engaged it and was largely ineffective." "Yes, and we are going." Elena looked at the indicator light. "Yes," she said. "We're going." The indicator light pulsed once more, and in the walls of the Prometheus all around her, Elena heard the deep, low sound of power levels climbing, of systems coming online, one after another, of a ship that had been patient for 81 years beginning at last to be itself again. "Then let us not waste time," Ares said. Elena smiled. "Agreed," she said. The Galactic Net noticed something strange on the third day after the Battle of Veeth 7. It started with a post from a Death astrophysics student who was using the University of Keith Prime's long-range sensor array for a routine observation project. She was not looking at the Kepler belt. She was measuring background radiation in a different part of the system entirely when her equipment registered an anomalous power reading 47 astronomical units from Earth's sun. She noted it, filed it as a possible instrument calibration issue, and moved on. 2 hours later, an automated monitoring satellite that the Verith Tourism Board operated near the Kepler belt to alert them when new tourist vessels were approaching registered similar readings. Power levels in the belt had climbed by a measurable amount from the baseline it had recorded over the previous decade. The satellite's automated report went to a server that a junior breath technician reviewed every 3 days. The technician looked at the numbers, looked at the baseline, noted that something had changed, and filed a follow-up observation request. Neither report went to anyone important. Neither report triggered any significant attention. The galaxy, in the days following Viet 7, had a lot of things to pay attention to, and the Kepler graveyard was not among them. But the Galactic net has its own ways of finding things. An amateur astronomer from the Solace Federation homeworld had a long-running hobby of pointing his private telescope assembly at the Kepler belt and posting images of the old human ships. He had done this for 20 years and had a dedicated following of about 12,000 people who found the ships interesting from a historical perspective and enjoyed his detailed photographic series. He had not intended to do anything scientific. He just liked the ships. He pointed his equipment at the belt 3 days after VTE-7 and took a long exposure image that he planned to post as part of his usual series. The image looked different. It took him several minutes to understand what he was seeing, and then several more minutes to be sure he was seeing it correctly. He posted the image with a single line of text. Something is happening in the Kepler belt. Within 3 hours, the post had been shared 60,000 times. Within 6 hours, it had been shared 4 million times, and 3 major Galactic Net news organizations had deployed long-range observation equipment to verify the readings. The verification was not in question. The power readings in the Kepler belt had increased by 6 orders of magnitude over baseline in the past 72 hours. 47 ships that had been registering as nearly dead were registering as very much alive. Not fully active, not yet, but climbing steadily, unmistakably on a trajectory that any competent technician could see was pointed toward full operational status. The Galactic Net exploded. The commentary came in several distinct flavors, and Elena followed all of them from her engineering deck, while simultaneously managing the activation of ship number 31, the ISV Keller's Promise, which was having a persistent issue with its port-side shield generator array that required her personal attention. The first flavor was mockery. This was the most common in the first 12 hours. The jokes were variations on a theme. Humans were so desperate to help that they were turning on their museum pieces. The ships would fall apart before they left the belt. Maybe Earth was trying to sell them as antiques to fund a real military. Chauvel posted a new video titled, "Oh no, they're actually trying," which got 12 million views before the day was over. His tone was amused rather than concerned, and his viewers' comments reflected the same mood. The second flavor was curiosity. This was smaller, but more thoughtful. Some people looked at the power readings and noted that they were higher than they should have been if these were simply old ships being turned on. Old ships of that generation should have had a maximum power output of a certain level. The numbers coming from the Kepler belt were in several cases above that level. Not dramatically, not in a way that was easy to confirm from a distance, but a number of analysts posted careful threads noting the discrepancy and asking what it meant. Most people in the first group made fun of the people in the second group. The third flavor was genuine alarm, but it came from an unexpected direction. 2 days after the readings went public, the Death News Network released an editorial written by one of their senior military commentators. The editorial was short and did not mince words. It said that the Union had just lost 56 ships to something its weapons could not effectively harm. It said that the null tide was 11 days from 2 inhabited death systems. It said that in this situation, mocking the only other fleet being offered to the Union was not clever. It was stupid. The editorial was shared widely in the death systems, and not particularly widely anywhere else, but it was shared. Zara and shared it from her personal account, without comment. By the time the third day ended, 17 of the 47 ships in the Kepler graveyard had reached full operational status. Elena ran the numbers on her display and told her engineers they needed to hold their pace. The remaining 30 ships were at various stages of completion. Some were close, some had complications. The Bright Ruin had a problem with its main drive initialization that had taken Elena's best engine team 12 hours to diagnose and was going to take another 8 to fix. The ISV Harkin had a weapons calibration issue that was less serious, but still required careful work. Elena did not sleep in those 3 days. She catnapped at her workstation in 2-hour stretches when the work allowed it, which was not often. She ate standing up, usually something fast and not particularly good, which she did not notice because she was not thinking about food. She walked the deck constantly, moving from station to station and ship to ship via the facility's short-range transport pods, checking progress, answering questions, and making decisions. Ares was online by the end of the second day. Elena checked in with it during her brief walks back to the Prometheus, which was the ship she kept returning to, partly because it was the most complex, and partly because she found the conversations useful. "Current power system status," she said on one such visit, standing in the central corridor of Prometheus's command deck. "Primary grid at 93%, Ares said through the ship's internal speakers. The voice had developed a smoother quality since the initial activation. The process warms into something more fluid. Secondary grid fully operational. Reserve capacity is charged to 87% and rising. At the current rate, we will reach full power in 14 hours. Weapon systems, primary arrays are initialized and calibrated. The new arrays, the ones installed in the last 30 years, are still running self-diagnostic checks. I am learning their operational parameters. Some of the targeting systems use architectures I was not designed for. I am adapting. How long for the new arrays? 12 hours. Can you do it in 10? A pause. Yes. It will require prioritizing that process over some secondary systems, but the secondary systems can wait. Do it. Understood. A brief silence. Chief Engineer. I have been reviewing the battle reports from Vet 7 while completing my initialization. I have spent time analyzing the Null Tide's adaptive response to the Union fleet weapons, and the adaptation operates by analyzing the energy signature and frequency of incoming weapon fire and redistributing the Tide's mass in a way that reduces impact. It does this very quickly. The Union fleet used weapons that all operate on similar physical principles, directed energy in various configurations. Once the Tide adapted to one type, it was in effect adapted to all of them. Elena was quiet for a moment. "You've figured out its adaptation mechanism from the battle data. A working hypothesis," Ares said. "I could be wrong." "What does your hypothesis say about our weapon systems?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Our primary arrays operate on different physical principles from anything in the Union inventory. The Tide has never encountered energy in these configurations. It will adapt eventually. Everything adapts eventually given enough time. But the initial engagement will not look like Vet 7. How is it different?" "Significantly different," Ares said. Elena looked at the wall for a moment, thinking. "Keep running the weapon diagnostics. I'll want a full briefing when everything is online." "Of course," Ares said. "Chief Engineer, one more thing." "What?" "I read the council session transcript, the part about the offer being laughed at." A pause. "I want you to know that I am aware of what this deployment means, and I intend to perform accordingly." Elena allowed herself a very small smile. "I know you will," she said. Zara arrived at the Kepler facility on the morning of the 4th day. She had requested transit from VTH Prime to the Kepler belt the day after the Galactic net had started reporting the power readings, filing her request through official Sololis diplomatic channels as an authorized Union observer. The request had been technically approved. Nobody had thought to specifically prohibit observers in the belt, because nobody had expected there to be anything in the belt worth observing. Her courier ship docked at the facility's secondary port at 0600 facility time. Elena met her at the airlock. Zara Anon was younger than Elena had expected from her council session record, perhaps 30 years old in human terms, with the slender, pale build of the Sololess and wide eyes that were taking in everything around her with intense attention. She had a data recorder around her wrist and a diplomatic sash across her uniform, and she looked at Elena in a way that suggested she had been forming opinions about her for several days. "Chief Engineer Vasquez," she said, "thank you for authorizing my access." "Your transit documents were in order," Elena said. It was not precisely a warm welcome, but it was not unfriendly either. "I'll show you around. Stay close and don't touch anything unless I tell you to." Zara nodded and followed Elena through the facility's corridors. What happened over the next 2 hours was something that Zara Anon would write about for the rest of her life, and never quite feel she had described adequately. Elena took her through the facility and then via transport pod to the interior of the ISV Prometheus, which was the ship nearest to the facility and the most advanced of the 47. She walked Zara through the ship's main corridors in a way that suggested she had been there so many times she no longer really saw it, and let the soulless delegate look at what was around her. The interior of the Prometheus did not look like a 200-year-old warship. It looked like something that should not exist yet. Zara stopped walking in the Prometheus's main weapon corridor and stared at the installation running the length of the walls. She had been on British warships. She had toured Union military installations as part of her diplomatic training. She had seen the most advanced weapons in the Union inventory. What was in Prometheus's weapon corridor was not those things. It was not even in the same conversation as those things. "How?" she said, and then stopped, because the question was too large for a single word, and she was not sure where to start. 200 years, Elena said simply. Zara looked at her. "Everyone thought we were decommissioning the ships," Elena said. "The paperwork said decommissioning. The official report said decommissioning. The yearly Union registry updates said decommissioning." She looked at the weapon corridor with the expression of someone looking at something they love very much. "We were doing the opposite. For 200 years, our best engineers worked on these ships in a place nobody was watching because nobody thought there was anything here worth watching." She looked at Zara. "You laughed at us. All of you. For a long time. That was fine. It was useful." Zara thought of the council chamber, of Cathar's voice, of her own silence. She thought of the death editorial and the border systems and 12 billion people. "I didn't laugh," she said quietly. "No," Elena said. "I know." She turned and continued walking. "Come on, I want to introduce you to someone." She took Zara to Prometheus's command deck and stood at the center console. "Ares," she said, "Chief Engineer." The voice came from the ship's speakers, clear and precise. Zara froze. She looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the console. "This is Delegate Zara and of the Sololess Federation," Elena said. "She's a Union observer. I'm giving her briefing-level access to your status reports." "Understood." Ares said, "Delegate on. It is good to have a guest aboard. It has been a while." Zara found her voice. "How long have you been operational?" "I first activated it in 2600. I went into deep sleep maintenance mode in 2766 during the early phase of the refit program. I returned to full operation 3 days ago." A pause. "I was informed of the situation during my initialization. I have had considerable time to think about it since then." "And what do you think?" Zara asked. The ship was quiet for a moment. Then Ares said, "I think the null tide has made a significant error in judgment, but it does not know that yet." Zara looked at Elena. Elena looked back at her with the same expression she always had, which was calm and certain and completely without doubt. "You need to go back to the council," Elena said. "Today. Tell them what you've seen." "They won't believe me," Zara said. "Some of them will," Elena said. "The ones who matter will." She paused. "And in 3 days, everyone will believe it anyway because we'll be done here." Zara Anon left the facility 2 hours later. She composed her report to the Solis Council and the Union Council in transit, working fast and carefully, trying to describe what she had seen in a way that would land correctly for people who had been laughing at human warships 1 week ago. She sent the report, then sat back in her seat and looked out at the stars. On the galactic net, the coverage of the Kepler belt had not slowed. The power readings were public information now, tracked by dozens of independent sensors, and reported on by every major news organization in the Union. The ships were clearly activating. The commentary was still largely mocking, though the tone had shifted slightly in the last day. There were more threads asking what the power readings actually meant. There were more analysts looking at the numbers and noting that they were not what anyone expected from old ships. Teshorval posted a new video. In it, he stood in front of a display showing the belt's power readings and said with his usual cheerful confidence that whatever the humans were doing would make for entertaining footage when their ancient ships fell apart trying to leave the belt. He had 12 million viewers watching live. His comment section was full of people who agreed with him. In the Kepler belt, the day shift ran into the evening shift, and the evening shift ran into the night shift, and the engineers did not stop working, and the 47 ships that the galaxy was watching grew brighter one by one in the cold, dark of the asteroid belt. 31 of them were at full operational status by the time the sun rose on the facility's artificial day cycle. 8 more were within 6 hours of completion. The remaining 8 were being worked on with the kind of focused urgency that engineers produce when they understand what is at stake and believe in what they are doing. In the command deck of the Prometheus, Ares was running continuous analysis of the null-tide battle data and calculating engagement patterns. The AI had been running those calculations since it came online and had generated 47 distinct tactical approaches, discarding those that relied on assumptions it could not verify and refining those that held up under scrutiny. It had also quietly, and without being asked, been reading everything it could access about the 46 other ships in the fleet, their upgrades, their capabilities, their AI systems. Several of the other ships had AI cores. Most were less developed than Ares, having been installed more recently and having had less time to mature. Ares began communicating with them through the facility's internal network, not giving instructions, but introducing itself, sharing analysis, answering questions. It was on its way doing exactly what the human engineers on the deck below were doing, getting ready. On the 10th day after VTE-7, the null tide reached the first of the Drath border systems. The reports from the few automated stations still functioning at the edge of the system showed the tide entering from the outer boundary and beginning its advance toward the inhabited worlds inward. The stations that sent those reports went dark within hours of sending them. There were no ships in the system to do anything. Evacuation of the planetary populations had been attempted, but was incomplete. 1,400 transport vessels had been working around the clock for 6 days and had managed to move approximately 40% of the civilian population to safer systems. 60% of the population was still on those planets when the tide entered the system. The Council convened in an emergency session for the 3rd time. Cathar's fleet was still undergoing emergency rearmament and was not ready. Other Union members were preparing ships, but nothing was ready to deploy in hours. In the chamber, a Reith senior delegate stood and said carefully and formally that the Council should consider reopening the question of the human assets in the Kepler belt. Nobody laughed. The motion passed by a wide margin, and the Council chair sent an official communication to Admiral Okafor's staff on Earth. The reply came back in 40 minutes. It said the Relic Fleet will be ready to deploy in 36 hours. In the Kepler belt, Elena read the deployment authorization and stood at the center of her engineering deck and looked at her 200 engineers, most of whom had not had more than 4 hours of continuous sleep in 10 days. 36 hours to completion, she said. Then we move. Nobody complained. Nobody asked for more time. They looked at each other and at their displays and at the ships outside the viewports that were almost ready. And they went back to work. Outside, the 47 ships of the Relic Fleet waited in the cold and the dark, their power readings climbing, their systems warming, their AI cores thinking in the quiet of deep space. The galaxy was watching. It still did not know what it was watching. That was about to change. Captain Ren Choi arrived at the Kepler facility on the morning of the 36th hour. He came alone on a fast military courier ship. No staff, no extra equipment, just him and a small personal bag, and the orders that had been transmitted to him 14 hours earlier at Earth Station 1. He was 31 years old, the youngest captain, currently holding a command-grade commission in Earth's military with the kind of lean and focused quality that came from spending most of his adult life in training that never quite stopped. His record was long and specific and extremely good. He had been selected for this particular assignment 3 years ago and had known about it since then without being told when it would happen. And when the message came, he had packed his bag, said goodbye to no one in particular, and left within the hour. He read his orders again during the transit. They were not long. He was to take command of the ISV Prometheus, the flagship of the Relic Fleet, under the operational authority of Admiral Okafor's emergency deployment authorization. He was to work with the ship's AI core, designated Ares, to complete final readiness checks. He was to have Prometheus and the fleet ready to jump in 36 hours. Ren had read a great deal about Prometheus in the 3 years since his selection. He had read its original technical specifications, the public version that anyone could access, and the classified upgrade documentation that required his command clearance to see. He had read battle analysis documents and tactical studies and engineering reports. He had watched the Teshorval program about the dead fleet once by himself in the privacy of his quarters and turned it off after 7 minutes. He docked at the facility, cleared security, and was met by a young engineer named Tomas, who looked like he had not slept properly in a week. "Captain Choi," Tomas said, "Chief Engineer Vasquez asked me to bring you directly to the Prometheus. She's aboard." "Let's go," Ren said. The transport pod crossing from the facility to the Prometheus took 4 minutes. Ren spent them looking out the pod's small side window at the hull of the ship growing larger as they approached. The exterior looked exactly like the net coverage had always shown. Dark, scarred, battered metal, faded markings, sealed gun ports, the marks of 2 centuries of deep space exposure on every surface. What the exterior did not show, and what Ren had spent 3 years knowing, was that those marks were intentional. The scarring pattern had been maintained, not by actual damage, but by the engineering team's careful cosmetic work. The sealed gun ports hid arrays that bore no resemblance to what those ports had originally held. The dark metal hull was not the same material it appeared to be from the outside. Prometheus looked dead on the outside for the same reason a trap looks like nothing at all on the outside. Ren Choi walked through the airlock into the Prometheus and felt the difference immediately. The air was clean and pressurized correctly. The lighting was on full spectrum. The deck under his boots hummed very slightly with the vibration of power systems running at high levels. The corridors were wider than ships of this era usually had because the original interior walls had been rebuilt during the refit to accommodate the upgraded systems behind them. Elena Vasquez was waiting for him at the junction of Corridor 3 and the main lift. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her. Neither of them was the type to say things that did not need saying. Ship status. Ren said 99% across all primary systems. Elena said the last 1% is weapon array fine-tuning that Ares is finishing now. We have 4 hours. Good. He looked down the corridor. I'd like to meet Ares. That's where we're going. They walked to the command deck. Ren stopped in the center of the space and looked around at the consoles and screens and the deep, steady glow of the power indicators on every wall. It was not what anyone outside this ship would have imagined the inside of a 200-year-old human warship to look like. "Ares," Elena said. "Captain Choi is here." The captain said the voice from the ship's speakers. Ren registered that it was a very good voice. Clear, measured without the slightly artificial quality that most AI systems carried. "I have reviewed your service record. I am satisfied with your selection." Ren raised an eyebrow. "Thank you," he said. "I am not saying this is a pleasant thing," Ares said. "I am saying it because we will be in combat together, and I wanted you to know my assessment." Fair enough, Ren said. My assessment of you is that I've read everything available about your original design and your upgrade history, and I think you're the most sophisticated AI system that's ever been built on a warship. What's your assessment of our situation? Honest answer, Ares said. Always. The Null Tide has never faced a weapon system like ours. The initial advantage will be significant. However, the tide adapts, and the rate of adaptation is fast. We will not have unlimited time to work with our advantage. We will need to be decisive in the opening engagement. A pause. I have been developing tactical plans that attempt to use our advantages in a concentrated way in the first minutes of contact before the adaptation can progress. I would like to discuss them with you when you have settled. Well, discuss them now. Ren said, I don't need to settle. Ares ran the tactical plans. Ren listened, asked questions, pushed back on 3 elements, and approved the rest with modifications. Elena listened to the discussion from the side of the room and let it run, not interrupting. She had known for 11 years that the moment of genuine use would look like this. 2 intelligences working out a problem together, quickly and without pretense, because the time for everything else had passed. The briefing to Admiral Okafor happened 6 hours before departure, over a secure channel from the Prometheus's communication room. Ren sat at the table. Elena sat beside him. The screen showed Okafor's face, which looked the same as it always looked. Status, Okafor said. All 47 ships at full operational readiness. Ren said Ares has confirmed weapons at 100%. Engines are ready for extended range jump. The other AI systems across the fleet are operational and worked. Good. Okafor looked at them both. I want to be clear about what happens when you arrive at the Drath border system. The Union fleet has a presence there now, about 60 ships, a mix of Wrath and others, attempting to hold a defensive line. They are not succeeding. The Null Tide is already in the outer part of the system. He paused. Cathar is on site. He will not be pleased to see the Relic Fleet arrive. Understood, Ren said. Your orders are simple. Engage the Null Tide. Use everything you have. Okafor looked at the camera for a moment. Ren, I don't know what's actually in those ships. I've read the summary reports. I understand the general scale of it. But the engineers who built those upgrades are the only ones who truly know. He looked at Elena. Vasquez, how good is it? Elena thought for a moment. She was not a person who inflated things or deflated them. Admiral, she said. The Breath have the best warship in the Union, the Eternal Claim. You know it, I do. What we have is not better than the Eternal Claim, in the way that the latest version of something is better than the previous version. Elena said, what we have is different in the way that a jet aircraft is different from a propeller aircraft. Both are flying, but they are not the same kind of thing. She paused. There are 47 of those ships. They have been worked on by the best minds Earth has produced for 200 years in secret, with no external constraints on what they could explore or try. She met Okafor's eyes through the screen. The galaxy has been laughing at us for a long time. Admiral, what I can tell you is that the thing they were laughing at is not the thing they think it is. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then go, he said. Don't waste time. The fleet formed up in the belt at 1600 hours facility time. 47 ships moving from their positions in the belt into a loose formation that tightened as they came together. The Prometheus was at the head. The Ardent and the Bright Ruin flanked it. Behind them, the other 44 ships arranged themselves in the formation that Ares and the other AI systems had worked out. Built around the principle of concentrating maximum firepower in the opening seconds of engagement while maintaining fleet cohesion. Nobody in the fleet said much during the forming up. The internal channels were mostly quiet. Engineers ran their last checks. Captains confirmed readiness. Ares coordinated with the fleet AI network and confirmed that all 47 vessels were linked, sharing sensor data in real time, able to act as a single system in ways that individual ships in most fleets never achieved. The Galactic net, which had been watching the belt's power readings for days, was watching in a different way. Now, ships were moving. Long-range cameras and sensors were tracking the formation as it assembled. The footage was being broadcast live across the Union, and the commentary was mixed. The mockery was still present, but more muted than it had been. Other voices were asking questions that the early dismissals had drowned out. Some were asking about the power readings. The readings from the forming fleet were considerably higher than they should have been for ships of this class and age. Not slightly higher, considerably higher. One analyst on a mid-tier technical commentary channel posted a careful breakdown of what the sensor reading suggested about the fleet's power output and what that output level meant in terms of weapon capacity. The breakdown was technically accurate and deeply unsettling if you understood what you were reading. The post sat at 100 views for the first 20 minutes. Then someone shared it to a bigger network. And by the time the fleet was fully formed, it had been seen by 200 million people and was being frantically discussed by everyone who understood what power readings actually meant. Teshorval, to his credit, read the analysis and paused his usual commentary for nearly an hour. When he came back, his tone was different. He still believed the ships were antiques, but the power readings were making him uncertain in a way that did not feel good. On the bridge of the Eternal Claim, at the outer edge of the first Death Border system, Admiral Cathar was managing a deteriorating situation with the focused discipline of a very experienced commander who was deeply unhappy with his circumstances. The null tide had pushed into the system further than expected. The defensive line he had set up at the midpoint of the system was holding barely, but it was holding in the way that a wall holds when water is slowly working through the cracks. His weapons were doing damage to the tide, he was sure of that. But the tide was adapting, and the rate of adaptation was faster than any new weapon configuration his teams could cycle through. Every time they found something that worked better, the tide adjusted. Every time they found a configuration that pierced deeper, the tide redistributed. He had lost 4 more ships in the last 6 hours. Not destroyed, Doc. He was not using the word lost yet, not officially, but in his private thoughts, he was using it. Then his communication officer said, "Admiral, we are receiving an approach signal from the Kepler Belt fleet. They are requesting navigation clearance to jump to this system." Carr looked at his officer for a moment. "The humans," he said. "Yes, Admiral." He was quiet for a longer moment than he would have liked. His pride was doing one thing and his judgment was doing another, and they were not in agreement. He looked at the tactical display where the tide's advance was mapped in red, and his defensive line was mapped in a blue that was thinner than it had been 12 hours ago. "Grant clearance," he said. The communication officer sent the clearance. Cathar looked at the tactical display and thought with the specific discomfort of someone who had been wrong about something important. Those old ships had better have something in them that isn't in the pictures. He did not say this out loud. The fleet jumped. Jump travel worked differently for the Prometheus than it did for most ships. The jump drive that had been installed in the first refit 80 years ago and progressively upgraded since was not the standard Union configuration. It was faster, more precise, and used considerably less fuel to cover the same distance. Ares had calculated the jump with exact coordinates, placing the fleet's exit point at a specific location relative to the battle zone that gave them the approach angle the tactical plan required. For Ren Choi, the jump felt like every jump he had ever experienced. A deep vibration, a moment of total sensory dislocation, and then the sudden hard clarity of normal space again. What he saw on the view screen when normal space returned was not what he had expected, though the tactical data had told him what to expect. Seeing it was different from reading it. The null tide filled the inner part of the system like a stain. It was bigger than the battle footage from VTE-7 had made it look, because the footage had been taken from a distance, and the cameras had been trying to fit it into a frame it did not fit into. Up close, it was immense. It was dark, and it was moving, and it was not stopping. And along the ragged edge of it, you could see if you knew to look at the dark and silent shapes of ships that had gone in and not come back. The fleet exited the jump cleanly, Ares said. All 47 ships confirmed in position. We are at a tactical entry point. Open a channel to the Eternal Claim, Ren said. The channel opened, and Cathar's face appeared on the communication screen. He looked at Ren for a moment with an expression that was complicated. Admiral Cathar, Ren said. Captain Ren Choi, ISV Prometheus. We're here to help. I'd suggest you keep your fleet at current positions and hold the defensive line while we engage the leading edge. Cathar looked at him. Then he looked at the sensor readout on his own display that showed the Relic Fleet power signatures. Whatever he was reading there changed his expression in a way he probably did not intend to show. Captain Choi, he said, those power readings your ships are showing, can you explain them in detail? After this is done, Ren said. Right now, I'd like to ask you to hold your position and watch a pause. You tread, Cathar said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite the tone he usually used. Be careful, Captain. That thing is not what it looks like from a distance. Neither are we, Ren said. He closed the channel. He looked at the null tide on the view screen. He looked at Ares' tactical display, where the 47 ships of the Relic Fleet were arranged in the formation that had been planned and refined and checked and rechecked for 3 days. He thought about the breath and the council chamber and the laughter and Teshorval's program and the 200 engineers in the Kepler belt who had not slept properly in 2 weeks, and the 200 years of engineers before them who had come to the graveyard and worked in the cold and the dark and the silence quietly and without recognition, building something that the galaxy did not know existed. He thought about the 12 billion people on the planets behind the tide. Ares, he said, Captain, fire when ready. Ares said, firing. The ISV Prometheus opened up. What came from the forward arrays of the Prometheus was not the directed energy beams that the Union fleet used. It was not any configuration of weapon that the Galactic arms manufacturers produced or that the Union military doctrine had doctrines for. It was something that the engineers in the Kepler belt had developed in stages over 40 years, refined over another 40, and perfected in the final 20. Something that operated on physical principles that the rest of the galaxy's weapons industry had not yet found. It hit the null tide. The effect was immediate and very visible and very different from what the Union fleet weapons had done. The Union weapons had disrupted the tide's surface, and the tide had adapted. What the Prometheus's arrays did was not surface disruption. It went through the tide's outer structure the way a blade goes through water, finding something inside, finding the underlying organization that made the tide what it was, and applying force directly to that organization in a way the tide's surface redistribution could not defend against because the surface was not what was being targeted. The leading edge of the null tide tore, not disrupted, not pushed back, torn. A section of the tide several kilometers wide simply ceased to cohere. Its mass dispersing, its organization collapsed, the darkness breaking apart into something that sensors could read as residual particles rather than as the living consuming thing it had been a moment before. Behind the Prometheus, the rest of the fleet fired. All 46 ships coordinated through the AI network that Ares had spent 3 days building, firing in the pattern that the tactical plan described, concentrating on different sections of the tide's leading edge, tearing through it at 46 different points simultaneously. The attacks coming faster than the tide could process them, faster than any adaptation could account for, because 47 ships were firing in sequence. On the bridge of the Eternal Claim, Admiral Cathar watched the tactical display and was absolutely silent for almost 30 seconds. His communications officer said very quietly, Admiral, are you seeing this? I see it, Cathar said. He kept watching. The null tide, which at Vet 7 had adapted to everything the Union fleet threw at it within minutes, was not adapting. It was reacting, reshuffling, trying to redistribute in the way it knew how to redistribute. But the weapons hitting it were not weapons it had a template for, and by the time it was building one, the attack was already in a different configuration, and by the time it was adjusting to the configuration, the AI coordination was hitting 3 other sections simultaneously, and the tide could not build a response fast enough to stop the bleeding. For the first time since the Union had encountered it, the null tide was losing ground. That's Pilot said. Admiral, the leading edge has retreated 2,000 kilometers. That's when she stopped, looked at her display again. That's the entire section the Relic Fleet is targeting. Cathar looked at the display. Yes, he said. Yes, it is. He had been a military commander for 40 years. He had seen a great many things in that time. He had been wrong before, though not often enough to have made a habit of handling it gracefully. He reached for the fleet command channel. All Union ships, he said, hold position. Let the humans work. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Ren Choi heard those words on the open channel and allowed himself exactly 1 moment to feel something before turning back to the tactical display and the work at hand. The null tide was retreating, only slightly, only in the area under direct attack. There was a great deal of it left, and it was still moving, and it still had the power to do what it had done to 56 Union ships and 2 inhabited planetary systems. But it was retreating. Ares, Ren said, how are we doing? Extraordinarily well, Ares said. The primary arrays are performing above projected parameters. The tide has begun adaptive responses in the areas we've been targeting longest, but the rate of adaptation is slower than I modeled. I believe the simultaneous multi-point attack is exceeding its processing capacity. How long before it catches up? Unknown. It is faster than almost anything I have modeled, but so far, we are faster than it. Ren looked at the view screen, where the darkness of the null tide and the flashes of the Relic Fleet weapons made a picture that nothing in the galaxy had seen before. Keep at it, he said with great enthusiasm, Ares said. The fleet pushed forward. The battle lasted 9 hours. In the history of recorded galactic conflict, 9 hours was not a long time for an engagement of significant scale. There had been battles that lasted weeks, campaigns that ran for years, siege actions that went on so long that the commanders who started them were not the ones who finished them. 9 hours was, in military terms, relatively quick. In those 9 hours, the Relic Fleet fought its way through the null tide from the outer edge of the system to the inner region, where the inhabited worlds were, methodically dismantling sections of the tide as they advanced, tearing apart its leading edge and its flanking masses and the deep central structures that the Union's tactical analysts had never been able to clearly identify because their ships had never gotten close enough to map them without going dark. Prometheus led from the front the entire time. That was Ren's choice. Ares had noted that a leading position carried the highest exposure to tide contact and suggested positioning the flagship in the second formation layer, where it could coordinate without direct risk. Ren had listened to this suggestion and declined it politely. Prometheus went first. The tide was not passive. It was not a simple consuming cloud that could be torn apart without it responding. It pushed back. It sent concentrated masses of its own against the fleet flanks, trying to get around the sides of the formation, trying to find the spaces between the ships where it could insert itself and disrupt the coordination. It absorbed incoming fire in the areas it had analyzed longest and tried to redistribute in ways that reduced the damage. Building templates for what it was facing, the way it had built templates for the Union fleet at Vet 7. The difference was that at Vet 7, the Union fleet had given it time. The Relic Fleet did not give it time. The AI network that connected all 47 ships meant that the moment Ares detected an adaptive response forming in one area, the attack pattern across the whole fleet shifted. Weapons that had been working in one configuration switched. Targets that had been the focus of multiple ships' fire were abandoned in favor of fresh sections that the tide had not yet had time to analyze. The fleet moved like a single organism, not like a collection of individual ships, each making its own decisions. And the tide's adaptation engine, which had demolished the Union fleet through sheer speed of learning, could not keep pace with something that changed faster than it could learn. At the 2-hour mark, the tide had retreated from the outer system. At the 4-hour mark, it had retreated from the mid-system. At the 6-hour mark, it had contracted to a mass centered roughly at the L4 point of the third planet, and it was no longer advancing. It was, for the first time in any recorded observation of the null tide, simply sitting still. Ren noticed this and said, "Ares, is it stopping?" "It has slowed significantly," Ares said. "I believe it is re-evaluating. This is not a behavior it has exhibited before in any of the battle data I have reviewed. It is in essence stopping to think, can it win from here? If we continue the current approach, no. Ares said, our weapon systems are still effective against it. The adaptation has progressed in the areas we have been attacking longest, but not to the point of neutralizing our capability. If we concentrate the fleet on the remaining mass over the next 2 to 3 hours, the outcome is not in doubt. Ren thought for a moment. He looked at the tactical display and the sensor readings showing the tide's contracted mass. He thought about the tide's adaptive intelligence, whatever it was sitting in there and processing. He thought about the 12 billion people on the planets behind him. How fast can it retreat? He asked. Based on its previous observed movement rates, it could exit the system in approximately 4 hours if it moved directly outward. And if it retreats instead of fighting, do we let it go? Ares was quiet for a moment. That is a strategic question rather than a tactical one. Captain, it is above my authority to answer. Ren reached for the fleet command channel. This is Prometheus Actual to Admiral Cathar on Eternal Claim. Secure channel, please. A few seconds passed. Then Cathar's voice. Channel secured. Go ahead, Captain. Ren looked at the display. Admiral, the null tide is contracting at the L4 point. We have it contained. My AI system believes we can destroy it completely over the next 2 to 3 hours of continued engagement. However, if it attempts to retreat, we can let it go and it will exit the system. He paused. I don't have the authority to make that decision unilaterally. The tide might go elsewhere. I need council authorization to destroy rather than contain. There was a long pause on that end. How confident is your AI system in the destruction option? Very confident. We have effective weapons, and the tide's current state is one it cannot recover from. If we maintain the attack, another pause. I will contact the council. Continue engaging. Do not let it rebuild. Understood. The fleet kept fighting. The Relic Fleet pushed into the contracted mass of the tide. Their weapons working with the same coordinated precision they had maintained through the whole engagement, tearing through the tide's remaining organization section by section, not giving it rest, not giving it time. 40 minutes later, Cathar came back on the secure channel. Council authorization received, he said. Destroy it. Ren looked at the tactical display one more time. He looked at the mass of the null tide, and what remained of it, and at the ships of his fleet surrounding it, and at the sensor readings on the planets behind him, showing life signs that were still there, still present, still safe, because of what the last 6 hours had accomplished. Ares, he said, full concentration on the central mass. All ships, everything. All ships acknowledge, Ares said, firing in 5 seconds. The Relic Fleet concentrated its entire weapons output on the null tide's remaining core. What happened next lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the sensors in the Drath border system showed no trace of the null tide anywhere in their range. The ships that had gone dark at VTE-7 and in this system remained dark. That was the one part that could not be undone, and Ren did not let himself think about it in the middle of the bridge with his crew around him, putting it aside in the careful way that people in his position learn to put certain things aside until there is a better time to feel them. But the tide was gone, he said. Stand down from combat stations. Damage report across the fleet. The damage report came back in minutes. The Relic Fleet had taken hits throughout the battle. The tide had managed to get close enough to several ships to affect their systems in various ways. The ISV Harkin had lost its secondary shield grid. The ISV Sable had a weapon array down. 8 other ships had moderate system damage. No ship had gone dark. No crew member was dead or missing. 47 ships had gone in. 47 ships were still there. Ren sat in his command chair and let out a breath. Good work, he said. Not to anyone in particular, and to everyone at once. On the fleet network from 46 other ships came the sounds of crews reacting to what they had done. The sounds that people make when something that was supposed to be impossible has just been done, and the reality of it is arriving. Ares Ren said, Captain, good work. A pause. Thank you, Captain. This is what we were built for. The galactic net was something else entirely. The entire engagement had been watched live by approximately 40 billion people across the Union, the highest simultaneous viewership of any single event in the Union's recorded history. The long-range cameras that the news networks had positioned near the system picked up almost all of it, and the footage was being broadcast in real time, with commentary from every network simultaneously. The commentary had gone through several distinct phases. When the Relic Fleet first arrived and the initial engagement began, there had been a lot of noise and uncertainty. Commentators who had been mocking the fleet for a week scrambled to describe what they were seeing. And in the first minutes, some of them were still trying to maintain the tone that the ships were ancient and inadequate, because what was happening on screen did not match the story they had been telling, and the story was slow to die. Then the first section of the null tide tore apart under Prometheus's fire, and the uncertainty began winning. By the 2-hour mark, when the outer system had been cleared and the fleet was pushing inward, the commentary had changed completely. The voices that had been mocking were quiet. The analysts who had noted the power readings and been drowned out were now the loudest voices in the discussion, and they were correct, and everyone knew it. And the conversation had moved from, why are the humans sending those old junk ships to what are those ships? And there was no good answer to that question yet, because nobody outside a small group of engineers and military personnel actually knew. Teshoval had been broadcasting continuously for 9 hours. His face, well known across the Union as the face that had made so many jokes about the dead fleet, went through changes during those 9 hours that his viewers had never seen on it before. At the start, he was confused. In the middle, he was quiet in a way that was unusual for him. At the end, when the null tide had been destroyed and the battle was over, he sat in front of his camera for almost 2 full minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "I owe some people an apology." His comment section, for the first time in his long career, was completely silent for almost 10 minutes. Then it erupted. Admiral Cathar docked at the Prometheus through the standard military airlock procedure, arriving at the ship 3 hours after the battle ended when the fleet was still running damage assessments and the system's surviving automated stations were being checked for functionality. He came with 2 of his senior staff, which was more of an honor than he usually extended to ships he was visiting rather than commanding. He had calmed ahead to request the meeting and been told the captain was available. Wren met him at the airlock with Elena at his side. Cathar was taller in person than on the communication screens. He stood in Prometheus's interior corridor and looked at the walls the same way Zara Anan had looked at them. The same process of adjustment is happening in his expression. He looked at the weapon corridor. He looked at the power system indicators on the wall panels showing the ship's current output. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he looked at Wren and Elena. "I want to understand," he said. His tone was different from the council chamber. It was direct in the way someone is direct when they are setting aside the version of themselves that usually speaks in public. "Those ships, what they contain, how long?" Elena looked at him evenly. "The refit program began formally in 26 and 67, 200 years, but the planning started before that. The decision to do this was made in the early years of Union membership, when it became clear what humanity's position in the Union was going to be. You did this because we underestimated you," Cathar said. "We did this because we needed to be ready," Elena said. "And because the best way to be ready is to work quietly in a place nobody is paying attention to." Cathar was quiet for a moment. He looked at the corridor again, at the impossible technology in those walls. "At Veet 7, he said, I lost 56 ships. Those crews were experienced. Their ships were the best we had." He looked back at Elena and Wren. "You came here with 47 ships that are 200 years old externally, and you did what we could not do." "Yes," Wren said. Carr looked at him. "You could have offered this before Veth 7. You could have stopped this before we lost those ships. It was not an accusation exactly. It was more complicated than an accusation." Wren said, "We offered. We were laughed at. Cathar held his gaze. He did not look away. Yes, he said. You were. He let that sit there between them in the corridor, because there was nothing useful to add to it that was not simply an excuse. Elena said, Admiral, 56 ships worth of lessons is expensive to learn, but I think the lesson the Union takes away from this matters. She looked at him directly. Not the lesson about the Relic Fleet, the broader lesson. Cathar waited. When you do not know what something can do, Elena said, be careful about how loudly you announce that it cannot do anything. Cathar was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that his staff standing behind him had never heard him say in 40 years of service, and that Wren later recorded in his mission log because he believed it should be preserved. He said, You are right. He paused. I am sorry for what I said in the council chamber for myself and on behalf of my delegation. Elena looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. Then she added with the slight edge of a woman who had read 20 years of alien mockery over her morning coffee. The apology is accepted, Admiral. I hope it sticks. Cathar, to his credit, almost smiled. The council session that followed the Battle of the Drath Frontier, as it was officially named in the records, was unlike any that had preceded it. The chamber was full. Cathar spoke. He gave a complete account of the battle and of what the Relic Fleet had done, and he gave it in the factual and direct way that his best moments always were, without embellishment and without downplaying what he was describing. He stated clearly that the Relic Fleet capability was not comparable to anything else in the Union's inventory. He stated that humanity had been dismissed and mocked for things that did not deserve to be dismissed or mocked. He did not say this comfortably, but he said it. Then Okafor spoke. He had returned from Earth for this session, and he sat in the same position he had always sat in, and he stood at the same moment that he stood up and offered the fleet 3 weeks ago, and the room was completely different from the room that had laughed at him. The human delegation offers its full technical documentation on the Relic Fleet systems to the Galactic Union, he said. Not the ships themselves, the technology, the research, the 200 years of engineering that produced it. We are prepared to share this with all member species, subject to appropriate security agreements, so that the Union's collective defense capability can benefit from what our engineers have developed. The chamber was very quiet. Okafor let the quiet sit for a moment. We did this in secret because we had reason to believe that doing it openly would not have been taken seriously. He said, We no longer need to do it in secret. The galaxy has seen what we can do. We would rather build from here together than continue separately. He sat down. What happened in the council chamber after that was a long and complicated process. The way these things always are when hundreds of species need to reach agreement on something genuinely significant. But the direction of it was clear from the first hour, and Zara, who had gone back to the council the day after visiting the Kepler facility and been barely listened to, then found herself suddenly in the center of a conversation that everyone wanted to have. She wrote in her personal log that night, I have attended 49 council sessions. I have never seen it move like it moved today. When you give people a reason to change their minds that they cannot argue with, some of them actually do. She paused over her writing for a moment and then added, I think Vasquez would find that amusing. Elena was not in the council chamber that day. She was in the Kepler belt. She had gone back after the battle and the initial meetings back to the Kepler facility, which was already quieter than it had been. Most of the 200 engineers had been reassigned to the fleet for its transit back, and the facility itself was going through the strange process of being decommissioned for real now that the ships it had been servicing were no longer sitting in the belt. She walked the main engineering deck one last time. The displays were still on. The workstations were still active, running the last of their ship monitoring feeds. She walked it the way she had walked it every morning for 11 years, slowly looking at things as she passed them. She stopped at Tomas's station. He was still there, still one of the last to leave. He looked up at her. How does it feel? He asked. Elena thought about this for a moment. It was not a simple question, and she was not a person who gave simple answers to complicated questions. Like something finished, she said, and like something else just started. She looked at his display, which still showed the fleet status feed. 47 ships moving in for information back from the Drath system. You know what? Those ships are for real now. All of them. The whole system. I know, Thomas said. I keep thinking about the years I spent thinking I understood what I was working on. That's engineering, Elena said. You always understand less than you think, until you understand more than you expected. She walked onto the viewport. Outside, the Kepler belt was quieter than it had been. 7 ships were still here, undergoing the damage repairs that needed to be done before they could rejoin the main fleet. Their hulls were still dark and scarred, the way they had always looked on the outside. The damage the battle had done was to internal systems, to the parts that the outside did not show. She pressed her hand against the viewport glass. Ares, she said. The speaker in the wall beside her crackled. The Prometheus was several thousand kilometers away now on the other side of the belt, but its communication array was linked to the facility. Chief Engineer, Ares said, how are you feeling? It was an odd question to ask an AI. Elena asked anyway. A pause. I have been thinking about the battle. I have been running analysis of every phase of the engagement since it ended. I believe I understand now more fully than before why the refit program was done the way it was done. Another pause. It was not just about building better ships. No, Elena said. It wasn't. It was about building them in a way that required working without recognition, without approval, without anyone telling you that what you were doing was worthwhile. Ares was quiet for a moment. The engineers who spent their careers here in the dark, working on ships that the galaxy thought were garbage, chose to do that. They did because they believed in what they were building, even when no one else did. Elena looked at the belt, at the ships in it, at the dark and the cold and the starlight. That's one way to say it, she said. How would you say it? She thought for a while. We knew what these ships were, she said. We knew what was inside them, what they could do, what they were going to be able to do when the time came. The galaxy thought it was looking at junk. We knew what we were looking at. She took her hand off the glass. That's enough. Knowing the true value of something, even when everyone around you is calling it worthless, that's enough to keep working. Ares was quiet for a long time. Then it said, I think that is the most human thing I have ever heard you say. Elena allowed herself a small laugh, the kind that is mostly breath. Don't tell anyone, she said. 6 months after the Battle of the Drath Frontier, the Galactic Union Technological Sharing Accord was signed on VTH Prime. 47 member species signed the document. The accord established a framework for human engineers to work with allied species on adapting the propulsion, weapons and structural technologies developed over 200 years in the Kepler belt for use in a new generation of Union warships. The program was called the New Fleet Initiative. It was the largest collaborative military engineering project the Union had ever undertaken. The human engineers who were brought in to lead the initial design teams were almost without exception people who had worked at the Kepler facility at some point in their careers. They were not famous. They had not been on the galactic net. Nobody had made programs about them or given awards for documenting their failures. They showed up to the collaborative design sessions and sat down and started working with the quiet competence of people who had spent their careers working on something no one was watching. The alien engineers they worked with found them almost universally to be two things: excellent at their jobs and deeply unbothered by other people's opinions of their work. These two things, the alien engineers gradually began to understand, were not unrelated. Tesh Orval's series, Visiting the Dead Fleet, was removed from the Galactic Net's main archive at its creator's request 18 months after the battle. In its place, he posted a new program, longer and more carefully made, about the history of the Kepler Belt refit program, told as accurately as the newly available documentation allowed. He called it what was actually there. He interviewed Elena Vasquez, who gave short and precise answers, and did not smile at the camera except once briefly, when Tesh asked her what it had felt like to read the comments on his old videos every morning. "Educational," she said. The new program became the most watched documentary in Tesherval's career. The ISV Prometheus was not put back in the Kepler belt. None of the 47 ships were. They were reassigned to active service and spread across the Union's patrol routes and defensive positions, visible and present in ways they had never been before. The Prometheus was assigned to the first Home System Defense Fleet positioned at Earth Station 1, where it was visible from Earth's surface on clear nights as a moving light in the high orbit track. Ren Choi remained its captain. Ares remained in its mind. On the day Prometheus took up its station at Earth, Ares said, "Captain, may I say something personal?" "Yes," Ren said. "For 81 years I was in the belt. I saw the light from the sun but from a great distance. Now I can see Earth from the sensors." A pause. "It is a good thing to be trusted with something worth protecting." Ren looked at the sensor feed that showed the blue-green planet below them. "Yes," he said. "It is." They kept watch, not because anyone was laughing at them now, not to prove anything to anyone, or to wait for the next chance to demonstrate what they were. They kept watch because that was what they were here to do. And because the galaxy, for all its noise and opinion and complicated history of knowing better than everyone else, was worth watching over. The ships that had floated in the cold dark for 80 years, mocked and dismissed, and treated as proof of a species that did not matter, flew now in the clear and the light where everyone could see them. They looked different than people had expected. They looked exactly as they had always been,